kick off this session. My name is Lea Kaspar. I'll be moderating this session on applying a principle-based approach to cyber capacity building. We have an hour for this session, and we'll start it off by having a moderated discussion with the panelists here, and after which I'll open it up to the audience. So this is an encouragement to all of you to engage in the conversation with us. We'll have some roaming mics, and some of my team will be helping out, kind of getting those to you. Just to note as well in terms of logistics that this is a hybrid session. So we have online participants, and I have an online moderator here who will give me a signal if we have anyone in the queue for the Q&A from the virtual room. Now, the topic of today's session, or this session that we're in, relies on a premise that in order to effectively implement cyber capacity building efforts, we have to have a set of principles that we all agree on. And based on that premise, over the last decade or more, there have been a number of efforts to develop different principles, or develop generally principles to help guide efforts to implement cyber capacity building, or principles that apply to cyber capacity building but are potentially even broader than just CCB. Now, what we will do in this session is have a look at the state of play. We'll look at what we really mean by a principle-based approach. I'll have my experts and practitioners here share with you we'll start with setting the scene, and then have a look at how these principles have been applied in practice so far, and specifically ways and the value that they've had in helping us achieve the goals of cyber capacity building, as well as economic development, cybersecurity, and human rights. Once we've kind of laid the groundwork, we'll have a look at some of the challenges to implement this type of approach, and see if we can find a way forward. If that sounds good, we'll start. Just to note, I have a stellar set of panelists here with me today. You can see them here on the screen, and I'll just briefly introduce them. I have next to me here Joyce Hakme, who's the Deputy Director of the International Security Program at Chatham House. To her right, I have my good friend and former co-chair of the advisory board of the GFCE, as well as the new director of the GFCE Regional Hub Africa, Mr. Mokhtar Yedali. Amy Clark, who's the head of the UK International Cyber Portfolio at the FCDO, and Juan Diego Castañeda, the acting director of Fundación Carisma from Colombia. So without further ado, I want to give over the word first to Joyce. Joyce, if you could kind of help us set the scene. What is it that we mean when we talk about a principle-based approach to CCB? If you could tell us a little bit about give us the lay of the land of what different approaches or principles have been developed, and as well as the value of them, and kind of the what and the why. Go ahead.
Thank you, Lea, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you today to talk about this extremely important topic. As Lea mentioned in her opening remarks, over the years there have been a number of initiatives that have developed principles for capacity building. Sometimes these principles have been directly developed for cyber capacity building, and more often than not, they have been developed in other contexts, such as development contexts. It started in 2011 with the principles of effective development cooperation, also known as the Busan Principles. These principles were agreed by 161 countries and over 50 organizations. And although they have been developed in the context of development, they also apply to CCB, cyber capacity building projects, if those projects are classified as international development. And if we look at those principles, which are four, they revolve around the following: country ownership, inclusive partnerships, focus on results and transparency and mutual accountability. So these are the 4 principles that the Busan process developed. Then a few years down the line, in 2017, the GFCE, the organization behind, or one of the organizations behind the conference today and yesterday, also developed principles, but for cyber capacity building, and included those in the 2017 Delhi communique. If we look at those 4 principles, they were very much inspired from the Busan principles, and as such, they're very similar to those principles. Again, they revolve around country ownership, inclusive partnerships, focusing on results, mutual accountability, and transparency. Now, the GFCE took them like a small step forward, but pretty much they revolved around the same. Few more years down the line, in 2021, as part of a UN process that includes all member states, the 193 member states, all agreed on a set of principles in the context of the UN Open-Ended Working Group, which is a process, for those who don't know, that brings all these states together to talk and decide what the rules of the road should be in cyberspace, which means what does responsible behavior in cyberspace look like, what does irresponsible behavior look like, what should countries do and not do, etc. And for a very long time, capacity building has been one of the main pillars of those discussions. But what happened in 2021 is that all states agreed to 10 principles in the consensus report for cyber capacity building. Now, those principles revolve around process and purpose, partnerships, and people. So 3 different Ps. If we look at those principles again, we will see that the Busan principles, the GFCE principles, are very much part of those as well. So that's why I call the Busan principles foundational principles, because they have been reflected almost in every single effort. So that happened in 2021, consensus agreement by all states. And there have been other initiatives in the, as I said, context of development, most recently in 23 this year, the donor principles for human rights in the digital age as part of the Freedom Online Coalition, and so forth. Now, an important observation is whatever set of principles you look at, which, as we said, have been developed in specific framing, they all have recurring themes, right? They all talk about the importance of demand-driven capacity building work. They all talk about the importance of focusing on achieving sustainable results. They all talk about importance of transparency and accountability, inclusivity, human rights, etc. So, which means, I think this is quite a powerful message, that regardless of the context, these themes are extremely important and will remain so in every capacity building project. Now, the second part of your question was, what's their value, right? Like, what are they? We talked about it. What's their value? And I think that's a very important question, because if we don't subscribe to the value, we're not going to, take them forward or implement them. And I think this is what this session is trying to do. So at Chatham House, we have a project that we're working on at the moment with the support of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs that is exactly looking at the OEWG principles, the 10 of them. And the idea and the objective of that project is first to socialize them, create awareness about their existence, but importantly, try to operationalize them, try to say to the different stakeholders who are interested in adopting a principles-based approach, giving them a way of how they could do that. So as part of this work, we sort of then, to kind of help think about what would be the best way to do it, we took each of the 10 principles and we broke them down into different elements to see what is actually what are the elements that compose, that make up these principles. And we came up with 2 main buckets. I have to say, though, that because those OEWG principles were formulated at the UN as part of the first committee, which very much looks at international peace and security. The ultimate goal of them is to, build the capacity of states, recognizing that states cannot, if states want to cooperate with one another in cyberspace, they need to have a good capacity to do so, right? The other thing, which is very important, states need to build their capacity to be able to defend and mitigate against the threats that they have on their sort of infrastructure, on their people, on their economies. So the capacity building has always been a very essential part of achieving responsible behavior in cyberspace. So ultimately, those objectives, those principles, and capacity building more generally in the context of this work work aims at building more secure and stable ICT environment for all. But however, the principles, as we looked at them and when we broke them down into these different bits, we came up with 2 different buckets. The first bucket is, a process bucket. Basically, by following these principles, what you will end up with is better projects, right? More efficient projects that are results-oriented, projects that are built on existing needs or real needs, projects that have coordination and partnership. So really much better projects rather than, okay, we've done a capacity building project because we had to do it, right? They are built, they lead to much better kinds of projects. The other and very important one is, by following a principles-based approach, you would be actually doing that work based on the ethics and values that have been agreed upon in this UN work, but also more generally in other formats. And by doing so, you help protect against harms that might emanate from cyber capacity building. Now, some people might sort of find it a bit surprising to talk about harms in the context of cyber capacity building, but there are harms that do exist. And they can be intentional or unintentional. And if you allow me, I'll just say a few words on that. So we've looked at this as well as part of a separate thing, and we kind of also sort of classified those into 3. Maybe there are more, but these are the 3 that we thought of. So the first one is, think, for instance, of tools and skills that you have, sort of given to a country or stakeholder group, etc., as part of a CCB project that then are intentionally used to inflict harms, to basically conduct oppressive activities, and therefore violating human rights and fundamental freedoms. I'll give you a very quick example. For instance, surveillance technologies, which have very legitimate uses, like for law enforcement, for national security. If there isn't a human rights risk assessment, conditions and safeguard can be abused to go against, target journalists, human rights defenders, LGBTQI, and other vulnerable groups. And we have seen many stories about this happening, right? So this is an example of where this could materialize. Another one is you also give tools and skills to a set of stakeholders, but unintentionally they might cause harm. Why? Because they have been sort of delivered without the right level of training and assurance. For instance, you give a tool to block some malicious content, it ends up because people don't know how to operate those tools, it can result in exposing people to vulnerabilities or depriving them from access to legitimate information. And the third category that we thought about when we were thinking about these sort of harms or misuse from capacity building. As we know, capacity building, and there has been a lot written about the relationship between donors and beneficiaries and why they serve like big goals. They also serve the national interests of the states. However, there have been instances where cyber capacity building work or capacity building more generally reinforce dangerous or harmful international power dynamics at the expense of equitable transfer of skills, expertise, and knowledge. And this is maybe better known as conditional capacity building. Now, when we thought about these harms, we thought, okay, let's look at the principles and how the principles can help. And actually, if you look at the OEWG principles, let's say, each of these harms have a principle that could help sort of mitigate or address those. For instance, on the surveillance technology, the OEWG has a principle on respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms, right? On the unintentional harm, there is a principle around corresponding that the CCB has to correspond to identified needs and priorities, right? Understanding what is the need and how to deliver the CCB project. And on the powerful or dangerous power dynamics, there is a principle in the OEWG that talks about political neutrality. So all of these are sort of examples of how the principles and how following a principle-based approach can help create better CCB effort and help protect against those harms.
Thanks, Joyce. Can I just ask one question? The principles that you mentioned, in terms of the audience that they address, we have kind of different practitioners here coming from different parts of the, I want to say, the development or the implementing landscape, are they applicable to all of them, or are different principles applicable to different actors?
Well, so the OIWG principles have been developed in the context, as I said, of this first Committee on International Peace and Security. They were primarily addressed at states. But I think because they all sort of, as I said initially, they all sort of correspond to existing principles that have been developed for other audiences. So more or less, no matter what the audience, there are some underlying principles that we all agree are important.
That's great. So let's look at operationalization a little bit and go to practice. So how have these principles been applied in practice? And I want to start with Mokhtar. To what extent does what Joyce has just outlined resonate in your work, having been at the African Union and your role in government? I just want to get your perspective on how that's worked.
Thank you, Leah, for the question. I will look at it from 2 points of view. One of them is from the African Union point of view, whereby back in 2008, the African Union tried to really find out about those principles and see how to apply them. Back then, I believe we struggled with two issues. The first one is those principles, though they exist, some of them, they were not linked at what has been agreed at that time with the MDGs. And second, some of them did vehicle how we struggle with two definitions: how to define an attack and how to identify who's doing an attack. Because those are the starting point to start educate somebody in the field of cybersecurity. You build capacities based on what are you trying to address. And surprisingly, the definition of attack was not really, we find some of them that are not very orthodox. For some, they were very attractive, because when you say that attacking somebody in the internet, a leader in his image, is considered as an attack, or saying something bad about him in the internet is an attack, then we have a problem. Because the value here is not the same. While for somebody saying something about somebody in the internet or in the social media is considered as freedom of expression, for some it is considered really as doing something bad. And that is the first struggle we had within the government's kind of setup. And we abandoned the definition. So we went back to go to the normal definitions and the global principles of making sure that nobody is being harmed by what we are actually doing. The second challenge we have had is finding the national and African experts capable of really formulating and applying those generally agreed principles. Back then, the deficit of experts is, we couldn't really imagine how much deficit gap we do have. Until recently, the UNECA told us that currently today, we have a deficit of 3.5 million experts in the field of cybersecurity. So imagine in 2008 how many of them we did have. It's a huge gap. And this is the thing that most of the people in Africa struggle with, is the lack of experts capable of formulating a real cybersecurity strategy, policy, coordination principle. To address that, the African Union at that time also, 10 years ago, with the help of Internet Society, created the AUC-SEG, which is the African Union Cybersecurity Expert Group. And they still operate in the field so far. They have done tremendous amount of work by specifically making the Africa presence or marking the Africa presence in the international context, be it in the UN discussion, or be it at the level of really cooperating and coordination and linking the cybersecurity capacity building issue with development, now in the context of SDGs. So those are the real issues that is actually being addressed that are being addressed within the context at the national and regional and continental levels.
Thanks, Mokhtar, for bringing up some of those challenges. And I want to come back to some of that, but I want to turn first to Amy and Juan Diego to hear a bit from their perspective how you've been implementing the principles. And then I think I want to come back to some of the points that Mokhtar now raised, which are some of the challenges, and then how we address them, because I think that's really important to unpack. Amy, I want to come to you. You're obviously coming from the UK. UK is one of the kind of donor governments, I want to say. What has been your experience in kind of engaging in this topic and implementing the principle in the work that you do at the FCDO?
Thank you, Leah, and good morning, everyone. I hope you're all having a good conference so far. So my role in UK FCDO, I oversee our international cyber capacity building portfolio. So that's 6 regional programs spanning the globe. And throughout the work here, we really emphasize taking a principles-based approach. The way we do that is how we are funded. Whilst our funding comes from UK FCDO, it comes from a specific fund within the department called the Conflict, Stability and Security Fund. I think based on the topic today, the key word in that is stability. This fund means that we have blended funding that is both development and non-development funding. So the way we spend it, we have to ensure that we are complying with all the principles that come with development funding, regardless of where we are doing it. So that translates into, we have conflict advisors, we have to fill in OSJAs for any of the work we're doing in relation to human rights, we have gender advisors. Every program we run must be GFCE compliant, and it must also link into our women, peace and security agenda. This is really important for us. On one level, if we don't do that, we don't get the money, which means we can't implement our programs. But on another level, we really believe in this principles-based approach. The UK takes very seriously promoting responsible cyber behaviour. How can we do that if we're not, through our programming, applying this logic? And then to your question on how we can do that in some of the more operational ways, we do it through our entire program lifecycle. I know that I've got Kavisha, who's a project manager in the crowd, and we've also got some of our implementers here, so they can attest to this. We start at the very beginning with our tender documents, ensuring that all implementers understand the requirements of the reporting they will need to do, and that they need to have these specific components, such as gender, throughout the program. As I've mentioned, reporting, all of our implementers have to report on a quarterly basis and report against these principles that we've put in. And if for any reason we aren't hitting the mark that we need to, we will be constantly monitoring and evaluating that to ensure that we are able to bring all of our programs up to the level they need to be. And lastly, around monitoring and evaluation, we have at a portfolio level an implementer that is looking across all of our portfolio at the monitoring and evaluation we have in place and identifying gaps where we could bring programming up to this principled approach more concisely. I'll leave it there.
Can I, a quick follow-up based on something that Joyce said in her intervention? She kind of outlined those 2, I want to say, buckets of values of a principle-based approach, and one of them was making programming better and ensuring that programs can be delivered better. I'm just curious, like, if you have multiple types of principles that you have to comply with, is that a challenge as well for you? If you have, say, like 4 or 5 sets of principles and needing to integrate that into your programming?
I feel I should probably throw that out to some of our implementers, but I will answer for them. It is challenging. Well, the feedback we always get is we've got to do so much reporting. So it is a challenge, but it's something we still have to do. So we are, and a project we're currently working on is how throughout the program life cycle can we streamline as much of this work as possible, and then, you know, from that, do it across the programs, but it is a challenge.
Yeah. and I have Juan Diego here, and I think Fundación Carisma has been working in Colombia and specifically focused on how the principles related to human rights and international human rights framework apply to cyber capacity building at the national level. How does this conversation resonate in your work? What's been your experience on the ground?
Thanks. Well, what we do first is some sort of qualitative work, sorry, instead of the more quantitative of developing and following measures and following indicators. I guess I start with that because I guess there is also a question of how to know what we are doing, that we're going on the right track. And for us, it hasn't been more about following, as I say, indicators, checking boxes, but it is more about the dialogue we try to establish first with the government and then with the communities. What we do is to try to understand and provide digital security trainings with specific communities in Colombia, and we also engage in policy conversations with policymakers, both on the national and international level. And I guess what we have seen as a challenge first and foremost is to gain a place, civil society organization, in this conversation. And of course, in some spaces that is not, that doesn't seem to be true or relevant in a way, but when you're speaking constantly with the government, this is kind of the first thing you have to do. You have to say, like, yeah, there's something we can do here. And that challenge must be overcome at every change of government. We've been working on this now at this time 3 governments since we have the first cybersecurity policy in Colombia. So it is a work that we have to constantly do and usually begin from zero with every new official. So that is a big challenge. But more than that, it is to understand where the principles should be implemented. What does it mean in practice? So we at least understand this at 2 levels. One is the policy design, and the other one is policy implementation. And in both of those cases, to understand the principles, they could be as guides for what the officers should do or policymakers should do, but also what we see as a challenge is for them to take it as actual design principles. So it should be, the principle should be actually brought in the design and took decisions that actually set them into the policies instead of just guiding the action, because it brings the question of exactly what does it mean to follow, I don't know, for example, participation, right? Like, what is the place of that? So one thing is to say, it's to leave to the official the call for calling an open process, or to actually bring it because there is some sort of rule that forces them or makes them do that. Of course, to make it real, to make it substantial, there are other things, but at least this hurdle should be also placed into the design of the policy. But I also want to call from something that Joyce mentioned, which is the harms of capacity building, because this is something we have to face constantly. It's also the role of the state, not only as the source of capacity building or the first actor called to create this space, but as a source of threats. So being engaged with the community, this is kind of the most difficult thing to communicate to the government. It is how they become also a source of threat, especially due to their capabilities on intelligence and law enforcement. This lack of institutionalization and proper boundaries between all this work really becomes a problem for communities to engage meaningfully in all these discussions and to obviously have the rights secured in this space. But I guess part of the issue with communities and what we receive from them is to understand that threats and this whole understanding of threats and the space beyond specific technical issues and specific policy issues, but from other places we don't know. So for example, financial inclusion, right? There are so many issues around that. And what we got from people and what we understand, they need to understand a lot of issues related to authentication, to how a lot of internet security works. But the problem beyond that is, in this case, for example, financial inclusion. So many scams related to banking and all that. It is also an issue beyond this one of security. Also, structural gender violence. All the issues around online gender-based violence. What we do there is to understand and to go around the routes that already established the government, or that they have but they don't work, to try to secure the space in this issue. So it is not only about the specific conversation, but what comes from the communities is more like a bigger, more complex context. That is, when you go back to a conversation of capacity building, it looks way more complex and sometimes out of place, but that is what, making more complex this conversation is what might need to be done to understand the full set of threats and possible solutions.
But if I'm understanding you correctly, you have used the existence of principles as to anchor the work in your advocacy work with the government and beyond. Is that right?
Yeah, of course. The thing again is when you face the conversation of principles, for them it's a question of when exactly should we apply them. So what we try to turn this question into is the policies and choices that effectively implement the principles, or guide your action in particular cases that we call them to follow the principles.
So thank you very much, Juan Diego. I've kind of been gathering the different challenges that people have been mentioning, and what has surfaced so far, at least for me, but the panel can correct me. One is something that came from Mokhtar there, potentially like a misalignment or not necessarily an agreement of what the principles are, or their interpretation. Maybe that's what we can talk about. We can talk about the need for greater awareness and commitments to the existing principles as they are. And the third bucket that I've identified is the how do we actually move from principles to practice, or how do you move from commitments once you have them to then implementation? Would that be a correct, more or less, kind of, were we missing anything from when we're thinking about, because what I want to do next is move into what do we then do about it, but are we capturing the challenges correctly?
Yes. Somehow, yes. Because the example I have given in terms of definition of attack or attribution or identifying who, that is a basic thing to start with. Because if you want to address an issue, you wanted to make sure that you have formulated the issue properly. Because the formulation of a problem is a half solution of the problem. If I don't know what is an attack, how can I build capacities on what is attack? Because the whole principles is really to defend ourselves in making sure that there is no harms on anything that is being done. Now, if you define to me an attack as something that, if as a blogger or as a social media activist, define attacking the image of somebody is considered as a cyber attack, then we don't agree on the problem. But generally speaking, if you look at the principles as they are stated, nobody can dispute them. Coordination, cooperation, transparency, planning, all those principles are generally agreed principles. But those values sometimes embedded into the practicability or the implementation of those principles that will have challenges. That, I think, I help you formulate that.
Is Mokhtar, but can I push kind of on what you said, and just to kind of see, is this a question of different principles, or is this a question of interpretation of those principles? Because like from looking at from a human rights community point of view, the fact that all countries in the UN have signed up to the Declaration on Human Rights means that we all agree to what those principles are. That doesn't mean that when you come to implementation, that doesn't necessarily align. But at the level of principles,
it's an interpretation.
It's implementation. Okay. Yes,
interpretation and implementation. And adaptation of those principles to the local culture, the context, the geographical kind of setup. Those are the challenges where we're coming in.
That's interesting and links to what Joyce was saying, the fact that local ownership and the need for, I don't know how you framed it, that bucket, which is one of the, I want to say, one of the elements that cuts across the different principles, right? It kind of goes back to. Let's come back to that, but Amy, I want to come to you when, I guess in the donor community, what have been the efforts to overcome some of these challenges that we've identified?
Thank you. I think, is this on? Hello? Yeah. Just to build on that, I think that there's two bits. It's partly the how, but also the why. And, you know, as you were saying, you're going from the heady heights of the UN right down to implementers across the globe with different levels of experience in this. So there's a real piece around not just pushing out products and saying, we need you to fill this in, you have to have a gender project, but the why we need you to do this, how it links up, that's really important. And I think where we can make that easier is through case study examples of where the principle-based approach has worked very well, but also where it hasn't worked well, because those are the ones that stick in people's minds of, oh, I do need to do this, I do need to take account for conflict sensitivity, because if I don't, this could happen. So that is really crucial, and it comes back to the question you asked me earlier on the challenges, and there is a lot of reporting. It does add a lot more work on, so we really need that cultural change of all our implementers and also all our program managers to buy into why we're doing it. And then aside from that, I mean, I'm a program manager at heart. I like documents, operational stuff. And for me, I think it's products, tools, sharing best practice amongst the community and saying, well, we've done it like this. Have you thought of having this tool that you could use? And really using all of our connections to ensure that we are sharing those things for how we can do it best.
Juan Diego, does that tools, how have you experienced that as an implementer? Do tools help in overcoming some of the challenges?
Well, you always need to adapt the tools, right? Like you have a lot of toolkits, you have a lot of the principles themselves, you have a lot of information coming from everywhere, and then doing implementation in real life takes a lot of work and takes a lot of adaptation. So, for example, you go to places in which the discussion is about again, the diffusion, dissemination of non-consensual sexual images, and then people have a lot of questions on how to tackle that, and then you go to another place in which they really need to understand how internet works and how basic issues of platform regulation work. So the differences between talking to people on these issues and then the government, their needs and what they need to know also from platforms, from internet operators, from everybody in the community, I think it is very challenging to think about how to adapt. So part of the job now is to really be sensitive to the context. Which is, by the way, on the side of the government is one of the issues we tackle or we have to face the most, which is the securitization of all the whole discussion due to particularities in our historical context. So I think, yeah, that makes the adaptation is kind of the key of what we have to do.
But I kind of want you to give me a bit more on what should we do about that. So, what's your recipe for to overcome some of this?
Well, part of the I think that the biggest thing we can do is to take participation seriously from the very beginning. So both in the design of the policies and the implementation of policies. As I was saying at the beginning, part of the problem is to gain the space and to gain legitimacy for the relevant stakeholders. when you take participation seriously, you save a lot of time, save a lot of energy. We often have to come to policies and to programs very late, either on the design process or the implementation process, and then you don't have it's either a choice of you have to reject the participation because you don't want to legitimize a space you haven't been participating on, and they are based on what do you think wrongful assumptions, or you have to make it work in some way to your own needs or what we think should be done. So I guess participation from the very beginning and taking seriously governance and multi-stakeholderism would work a lot to prevent some of the issues and some of the waste of both energy, money that we have because we come very late to processes.
The multi-stakeholder principle, or the principle of involving stakeholders, if I had had a dime for every time someone said multi-stakeholder in the context of these conversations, I often kind of then ask the question, okay, we all seem to agree that involving stakeholders is important and we have to do it. So why, for 2 decades we've been talking about this, but then a new process comes up at the UN level, and you can see that that's still not happening. That's still not happening in a lot of our implementation efforts either. Joyce, I know that you've been looking at you mentioned the OEWG principles and kind of developing concrete guidance on how they could be applied. Do you have any tips or tricks on what might help in kind of bridging that gap from principle to practice?
Thanks, Lia, for this very important question, which we're all sort of like, thinking about, and we have identified some challenges. I'll go back to maybe the why and how that Amy mentioned. I think on the why, because I think before we decide how we want to implement something, we need to sort of remind ourselves why we're doing it and what is the kind of agreement that we have on this, like building on your point, Mukhtar. So if we kind of go back to the why, I think everyone agreed, and all states have agreed, about the importance of capacity building, right? For very different things, for development, for cyber resilience, for a number of different things, for maximizing the benefits from ICTs. Now, we all agreed on that, right? And then we agree, because we agree capacity building is important, we also agree that we need good capacity building, right? So what does good capacity building look like, right? The principles are an attempt to help us think about what does good capacity building projects look like and efforts look like. That could help us decide which projects are actually good and which ones can be improved. This can help with the evaluation piece that is also quite important when we think about CCP. Now, we need good CCB projects. The principles can help with that. We have all countries agree to the principles. That's really good, right? That's a very, very good milestone. Yes, progress is slow, particularly at the UN, which can be very frustrating, but I think it's also an important milestone that we need to recognize. Now, what do we do after that? I think there's a huge room for building awareness that these principles exist, right? Even when you're speaking to the stakeholders who should be driving these principles, sometimes we realize that they're not socialized to the level they should be, right? So there is this very important step around creating awareness on the existence of these principles. Now, then becomes the question of how we do it. And I think this is where it becomes a little bit trickier, right? Because as Mukhtar said, there are different contexts, and contexts will have different interpretation. But what we should be doing is we should start with the interpretation. What do we think these principles mean? And test them in different contexts. Inevitably, even if we all agree on what they mean, inevitably through practice, we will have to fine-tune them. We will have to refine them. I think someone said we have to adapt them. So I think we should look at those principles and this effort as more like a process, more like a journey, rather than a one-off thing that we do once and then we kind of stop doing it because we've integrated those principles. I think this has to be an agile approach, a continuous approach that takes into consideration not only how the contexts are changing, how the entire ecosystem is changing, how the threat landscape is changing, and so forth. And I think sort of once you do this interpretation, test it in different contexts, something I think Amy mentioned, which is extremely important, is create that collaborative environment environment to share information and lessons. What have we learned from each other, right? I mean, governments, sometimes they have their lessons for themselves, which help them then improve or change their funding approach. But there is a benefit. GFCE can help as a platform where we come together and say, what have we learned? Does this principle make sense or not? And we've looked at the principles, and some of them, you know, there is like a relationship between, because, you know, they don't sit in silos, there are overlaps. Sometimes there are tensions between them, but we'll only be able to understand those when we interpret them, when we put them into actually practice. And that's what we're trying to do at Chatham House. We're thinking about what they mean, and we're taking some project examples and just trying to sort of map out how this would look like. And it's not an easy exercise, but we're trying to do it, and it's been quite an interesting thing. The other thing I also want to mention is that, you know, there are some already, you know, like obviously we're talking about the OEWG principles, but as I said, these sort of like the essence of these principles have existed for quite a while. And for instance, like, you know, the gender piece that Amy mentioned, how you're integrating it in your funding, other donors are doing the same. We worked on a toolkit with the support of Global Affairs Canada that sort of helps integrate gender into cybercrime capacity building, because there's also this thing that while we might want to follow a principle-based approach, we sometimes don't know how to do it, right? So toolkits like this and I know GPD has done something similar, can help giving like practical guidance. This is, and even, as you said, like, you know, very operational, very practical. And I think that that's what we need. We need the big conversations, the geopolitical conversations, the different context conversations, but we also need the very basic kind of practical advice that can help us push this forward.
And at this point, thanks, Joyce. I do want to kind of gather a couple of questions from the room. Maybe just to pick up on something that you said, and so it's like you're breaking it down into, we need to build awareness and increase commitment. We need to test and interpret on the ground, and then learn together and collaborate, including through spaces like this. On that second point of testing, maybe I'll leave you with something to think about, is that we are testing in a social context, so we are not in a laboratory. So it's you know, we're talking about potentially like dangerous social experiments to test something and see whether it works or not. We're dealing with potential harms that you yourself mentioned. So I do wonder to what extent, you know, how we then protect ourselves from failure, and to what extent failure is a good thing in these cases when it comes to programming, which is something that I know a lot of donors have, you know, struggle with, as well as implementers. How do we report on failures? How do we report on when things don't work and then improve as a result? But maybe that's kind of a question that I have in the back of my mind for everyone to think about. Maybe we'll come back. I do want to kind of open it up to the room, and I have one person here in the front row. I have two, I'll take, and I have someone in the virtual room. So I'll take 3 or 4 questions, Ken as well. Let's start here and I'll come around. I'm not sure if I'll get to everyone, but I'll gather as many, and then I'll come back to the panel. So I won't take one, but I'll gather a couple. All right, go ahead, sir. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself. It's not working.
Hey.
Yeah, we can have this one. Thank you. Next one.
The light was green, but this sounds better. I'm Maarten Botterman. One of my roles is that for the IGF, I'm running a dynamic coalition on IoT.
Oh, hello.
And what we try to do there is establish global good practice. By having a kind of understanding of what that is, you have a lot of guidance that can help industry to organize itself, government to organize itself. How do you see the potential role of IGF, which is much more than that once time a year meeting?
Great.
It's all over the place, throughout the year, in the countries, in the regions. Would this help? Because I heard you about UN processes, sometimes difficult.
Great.
But IGF basically also is coming from the UN.
That's great. Thank you. Gentleman there in the gray jacket, if we could get the mic over to him. Would you mind raising your hand so that she can see you? Yes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Just to be sure. Okay, we're still good morning. Okay, so my name is Anthony, and I'm a consultant with the ICC Ghana. Okay, so I've just been listening to all we've been doing since yesterday, and because I'm a technical person, I'm just reasoning through everything, and I'm asking myself, so what are the pragmatic steps we taking to build this capacity? Now, years ago I had an experience. I moved from one country in the East and came to the UK. There are certain sites I could access for books and all that in that country in the East. But in the UK, I couldn't access them. Okay? Now, I come to Ghana, I can still access those sites, but not in the UK. Okay. All right? So then I think, okay, if you know how things work, then you are able to implement proper strategies that will enable you to build the capacity you want to build, okay? So there is intellectual property theft. There is the abuse of women on the internet, okay? So how do we do it? Where does it start? The telcos are there. And I'm asking myself, where is the ITU, okay, in all this conversation? Because the telcos can take a lot of the job, okay? I was actually talking to one of the biggest network designer for the telcos in the country, and I'm asking, are you protecting or filtering certain traffic from coming in? They said, no, it's a free flow. So, okay, so right there, we know that we have a problem. We're spending money. Don't abuse women. Don't abuse women. But the internet is bringing the abuse to their house. Meanwhile, we can stop it at the border. Then the little things we can do can enhance it the more. So what I'm saying is, I think that if we want to pragmatically solve this problem, it is in various stages. And we can, for example, UK can say, okay, Ghana, we realize that when we do our own checks, there are certain traffic you allow into the country, which is not aiding the purpose we're giving you the money, okay? You've got to do something about that.
Is that, would you mind wrapping up so I can get to other questions
so I'm just saying that there are various stages, and I think that if we can look at it holistically and apply the necessary force or, strategies, we will be able to do it.
Thank you very much. I saw one person here, one person behind there. Peter, would you mind handing the mic over to that gentleman or lady? Oh, sorry.
Yes, thank
Go
you.
ahead. Would you mind introducing yourself? Yes.
Yes, thank you. My name is Naro Mosaige. I'm with Access Now. I'm the Africa Policy and Advocacy Manager. So my question is, noting the lack of trust between civil society and government and how this deters robust capacity building efforts. For example, our first experience with cybersecurity in many African countries is that cybercrime laws are used to stifle dissent, attack journalists. How do we meaningfully engage with states in practical things like threats sharing, certs that keep people and systems safe and that still uphold principles like human rights?
Okay, thank you. I can take one more question and I'm going to go around. Okay, a gentleman here. Oh, do you mind actually first coming to Michelle here with the online question? I want to make sure that we're being inclusive. Yes, Michelle, if you don't mind.
My name is Michelle. I am Public Policy Director at Derechos Digitales. We don't have an online question, sorry.
But you have a question.
Just, I have a question. It's really, really quick.
Okay.
And it's to all the panelists. Like Joyce was telling us about the harms, and I think that we are worried about the harms and cyber capacity building. But the question is how to create awareness about these harms and to go beyond the principles and to go into practice. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. I know you gentlemen waiting. I will take that one, and I will take Kenneth's question as well, and then we'll go. Gentlemen, go ahead.
My name is Mr. Norton from India. I have very specific questions regarding the principle-based approach to cyber capacity building. As you know that there are many facets and challenges to overcome. First one is the awareness and educating people to report the online harms and the cybersecurity incident and data breaches. Second is the medium level capacity building of the people to proactively identify the harms and the security risk. And the third is high level capacity building of the people with an intent to increase the number of cybersecurity professionals. And the fourth is capacity building of the law enforcement agencies for robust responses to the reported cyber crimes. And fifth, and I think that it is also important to consider the incentivizing the people to report the cybersecurity breaches. So the harm can be addressed only by mitigating the fear among the people who are actually suffering from the harm. So incentivizing the people in many ways can also help. So is there any global standard framework that you are thinking for that angle?
Okay, thank you. One quick one there, Ken, if you don't mind keeping it short, and then let's come to the panelists. And in the I'll come to each one of you, but we'll have a short kind of so focus on what's most important. Ken, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. This is just a comment to add. My name is Kenneth Edu-Amanfo, Chairman for Africa Cybersecurity and Digital Rights Organization. I agree with all the comments and the in-depth points that were raised by the presenters, especially the challenges that were aligned. And I also believe that the best approach to cyber capacity building is using the principle-based approach. We can have all the principles outlined and defined, but as Mokhtar said, the implementation aspect is the challenge. How do you implement this? If you take the principle of collaboration and cooperation, it's awesome, it's crucial. But how do you enforce that? How do you enforce effective collaboration among different stakeholders, from government, from the industries, and for the civil society? How do you ensure that all this can work together? They can exchange information. That is a very complex issue. Now, when we look at the terrain that we find ourselves, cybersecurity, in a rapid technologically changing environment, there are different technologies that are coming up. So you have your frameworks, and by the time you try to implement and build capacity, there is new technology, that is coming up. How do you ensure? How do you ensure consistency in implementing this
okay, so there's a question.
Thank you
So much. So we had a question on this is future-proofing. We have a question of ensuring cross-jurisdictional alignment. We have a question about the role of the IGF. Take your pick. Does anyone want to come and address something? We have I'll give you kind of 45 seconds each. Who wants to go? Anything that's kind of. Joyce, why don't you, go ahead and let's kind of.
Thank you for all these questions. They're all very good, and I think there are things that are looking at questions on capacity building, and there are questions that are broader that we need more time to discuss. But I think what all these questions are raising are really the importance of how do we build more awareness? What are the practical steps? How do we enhance collaboration? Which is really exactly what we've been discussing on this session. On the IGF, I think we need all the platforms that can help share the lessons. And I think we've heard from all the questions, how do we work better together? How do we strengthen the collaboration? I think there's definitely a role for the IGF, and especially now that the IGF is at a crucial milestone, so that it definitely could play a role. 45 seconds, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Amy, did you want to go next?
Thank you. To be honest, I think Joyce just summed that up beautifully. The only thing I would add, and it more relates to the last question, I do think a lot of it comes back to the feedback loop. This isn't easy what we're doing. It's definitely even harder doing it in the cyberspace. So we constantly need to be listening to our implementers, to CSOs, to other donors, to learn best practice and keep learning and ensuring we're discussing between each other on how we can implement these things.
quickly and more provocatively to Martins. On IGF, we need to move to more consistent and operational recommendations that could really help people to move forward rather than staying as just general something that is in the air. On the issue of security itself, I believe the multi-stakeholder in the field of capacity building is a must, and it shouldn't really, everybody is concerned by safety and security. No matter which board are you, if you are an opposition or a freedom fighter or a civil society or whatever, you are concerned by safety. It's such as a neighborhood watch. And the neighborhood watch, no matter how the neighbor is bad, we're all concerned by the security. So there should be no distinction, and collaboration in implementing safety measures and principles is a must.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mokhtar. Juan Diego will have the last word.
I guess it boils down for us, from our perspective at least, because when you think about principle-based action, principle-based practice, whatever that is, it is about constantly and repeatedly trying to think and trying to engage in what it means, but this meaning is going to be built, is going to be crystallized, let's say, in every action, in every step of the action, or whatever process we're talking about. So in this case, it is the participation and the awareness and the context, the awareness of the context that might drive actually some meaning to a principle, but that is going to be achieved through meaningful participation, and it also means who do we exclude from certain conversations, in which stages, and why. So taking that seriously might lead some sense to the whole principle-based approach.
Thank you, Juan Diego. And what it comes down to, it sounds like, is more collaboration, and I'm really glad that we had an opportunity at this conference to bring different communities together, different communities of practice together, the development community, the cybersecurity community, the human rights community, to discuss how we can raise awareness and collaborate and learn together. So with that, I'd like to invite you all to join me in thanking the panel here and thanking all of you for your interventions and your active participation and listening to us today. So thanks, everyone.